During the First World War, the small firm Pemberton Billing from Woolston, England, was engaged in repairing naval aviation aircraft. Gradually, it began to build its own small machines. Toward the end of the war, the company was renamed Supermarine Works. In 1919, the talented self-taught engineer Reginald Mitchell, he was only 24 years old, became Supermarine's chief designer. The company placed its bets on aircraft that could land on water. In the 1920s, 1930s, Mitchell created several successful flying boats that were adopted for service in Britain and abroad. Southampton, 1925, Scapa, 1934, Seagull, 1937, Stranraer, 1935, Walrus, 1933. He gained wide renown thanks to a series of high-speed and racing seaplanes. In 1922, the Sea Lion flying boat biplane won the prestigious Schneider Trophy. In 1925, the floatplane S-4, already a monoplane, set a world speed record in its class. In 1927, the S-5 captured the trophy again. In 1929, the S-6 appeared, repeating the success and updating the record, and in 1931, the improved S-6B once more brought the trophy to England and beat the 1929 record. Experience with high-speed machines pushed Mitchell toward the topic of fighters. In the autumn of 1931, the Air Ministry issued specification F-730 for a new single-seat day and night fighter to replace the obsolescent Bristol Bulldog biplane. The requirements were vague and allowed freedom in engine choice, but the armament was stipulated rigidly: 4 machine guns and 4 bombs of 20 pounds, about 9 kilograms each. The early 1930s were a period of stagnation for the Royal Air Force. There was no obvious threat, and the economic crisis slashed the budget. As a result, competition for military contracts intensified. 8 firms responded to specification F-730. 5 proposed biplanes: Bristol, Hawker, Westland, Blackburn, Gloucester, and 3 others offered monoplanes: Bristol, Vickers, and Supermarine. Supermarine's project, called Type 224, bore little resemblance to the future Spitfire, but it is from this design that the famous aircraft's lineage is usually traced. It was an all-metal monoplane with an inverted gull wing. At the wing's break, the fixed landing gear legs stood in fairings, trousers. The 660-horsepower Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine used an unusual evaporative cooling system that promised good aerodynamics and low weight. The Type 224 first flew in February 1934 and quickly showed that theory and practice diverged. The chief problem turned out to be the cooling system itself. Water under pressure passed through the engine and turned into steam. The steam was cooled in the wing's leading edge and condensed back into water. It then drained into tanks in the trousers, and pumps drove it into the main tank ahead of the engine. On paper, everything looked simple, but the slightest fluctuations in pressure caused premature boiling. The pumps ingested steam, and the engine overheated. During rapid climbs, the steam did not have time to condense and vented through the valves, which made using the aircraft as an interceptor very problematic. The flight qualities of the Type 224 turned out to be mediocre. The Gloucester SS-37 biplane, the future Gladiator, won. It was faster, more maneuverable, and climbed better. The sole example of the Type 224 was written off in 1937 and used as a target on the range. But Mitchell did not give up and reworked the design. In July 1934, the Type 300 appeared, now with a straight wing, an enclosed cockpit, and retractable landing gear, including the tailwheel. With each version, the wing became thinner, and the fuselage contours increasingly resembled the future Spitfire. Initially, they planned on the Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine with evaporative cooling. As a fallback, they considered the Napier Dagger of about 700 horsepower. In November, they took a decisive step. They chose the new Rolls-Royce PV-12, the future Merlin. At that time, it produced roughly 790 horsepower, but it was expected to be pushed to 1,000. The Air Ministry supported the choice and allocated $10,000 for the construction of a prototype aircraft under specification F-3734. Until then, the work had been funded by the Vickers Group, of which Supermarine had been a part since 1928. By January 1935, the design already closely resembled the Spitfire. A thin, elliptical wing appeared. It provided low drag and high lift, and therefore better flight qualities. The horizontal tail received the same shape. The wing structure was made efficient, light and strong. The landing gear was unusual. It retracted outward and had a narrow track, but in this way, the loads on the wing during landing were reduced. The decision may have been influenced by German machines such as the Heinkel She-70, which were carefully studied in Britain. The engine's cooling remained evaporative for the time being. For takeoff, an additional radiator was deployed under the fuselage. In April 1935, a full-size mock-up was built. By this time, 4 machine guns were already considered too few. All-metal bombers were entering service in various countries. In 1934, 8 machine guns were required. The new specification for an interceptor influenced the concept most of all. The required flight duration was shortened, meaning less fuel, the bomb load was removed entirely, and the armament was set at 6 to 8 machine guns of 7.69 mm caliber, Vickers or Browning. Thus, the aircraft finally became an interceptor for fighting both fighters and bombers. In June 1935, models were blown in the wind tunnel at Farnborough, scale 1/24, and the horizontal stabilizer was raised slightly. Even more important, they abandoned evaporative cooling. Meredith effect ejector radiators were implemented, and they switched from water to an ethylene glycol-based coolant mixture. The overheating problem disappeared. The system became more reliable. By August 1935, all the changes had been incorporated into the design, and at the end of the summer, the first prototype began to be built at the Woolston factory. The aircraft aroused great interest among the military. In the Program F for the expansion and modernization of the Royal Air Force, the production of 300 single-engine supermarine monoplanes had already been planned. On February 18, 1936, the prototype aircraft K5054 was assembled and its engine was started for the first time. The plan was ambitious. By the end of March, factory trials, by the end of April, state trials, and by September 1937, series production. In practice, the timeline slipped and the machine immediately began to lag behind the nearly parallel Hawker Hurricane project that Sidney Cam was developing. The first flight was performed by Vickers chief test pilot J. Summers on March 6. After the first sorties, which were carried out by Summers and Supermarine pilot J. Pickering, adjustments were made. The horn balance on the rudder was reduced, the carburetor intake was lowered, and the cowling was reinforced. It vibrated. Rolls-Royce engineers filled, painted, and polished the aircraft using automotive techniques so that the surfaces would be as smooth as possible. At that same time, the aircraft received its name, Spitfire. Literally, it is one that spits fire, but in sense, a hothead, quick-tempered. After the refinements, the speed was brought up to 348 miles per hour, enough to compete with the Hurricane. On May 26, K5054 was handed over to Martlesham for service trials. By that point, it had a Merlin C engine rated at 990 horsepower. The trials continued until June 16th. Overall, the reviews were very good. Small things were noted. Distortion of the view because of the bulged windscreen, the absence of a landing gear extension warning horn, inconvenient access panels, and so on. On June 3rd, the Air Ministry ordered the first series 310 aircraft from Supermarine. On June 27th, the Spitfire was shown to the public for the first time and was called the fastest combat aircraft in the world. On July 8th, it was demonstrated to King Edward VIII at Martlesham. Refinement proceeded without pause. The landing gear doors were simplified, and part of the wheel was left exposed when retracted. It did not affect the flying qualities. A 3-bladed metal Ferry Reed propeller was tried, but they temporarily returned to a 2-bladed wooden one. A Merlin F engine, 1,150 horsepower, was installed. By December, armament and a radio set had been fitted to K5054 and tested in the air. In January 1937, the tail skid was replaced with a Dunlop tailwheel. 2 versions of the unit were tried. The prototype remained a flying laboratory until September 1939, when it crashed. In August 1936, a new specification F-1636 was issued for the production version. The requirements raised the bar, maximum speed, up to 450 miles per hour. In dives at such regimes, the prototype began to experience dangerous wing vibrations, flutter. The main spar was strengthened and the skin on the leading edge thickened. The mass increased by only 9 kilograms, while torsional stiffness rose by approximately 40%. The fuel reserve was increased. In parallel, the design was simplified for mass production. Cast, stamped, and press parts were used more widely. And all this, the small design bureau, fewer than 90 people under Mitchell, carried out while simultaneously working on 2 other projects. The ministry demanded the first production Spitfires already in October 1937, a task almost beyond supermarine. The firm had only two small plants in Woolston and Hythe, about 500 employees. Capacity was partly occupied by Walrus and Stranraer seaplanes, and the Spitfire itself was technologically more complex than the Hurricane. The solution was to distribute major assemblies to contractors and keep the fuselage and final assembly in-house. Different firms produced the controls, frames, engine mounts, tail surfaces, wing tips and leading edges, and ribs. In Eastleigh, two large shops were being built for assembly, and the output of seaplanes was being reduced. Production moved forward, but the deadlines again shifted. By the end of 1936, only 6 fuselages and 4 sets of wings of the older version had been assembled. The first production Spitfire, K9787, was readied for flight only on May 15, 1938, when Hurricanes were already in active RAF service. Test pilot J. Quill flew the machine and confirmed that the requirement for dive speed, 470 miles per hour, was exceeded with margin. The aircraft demonstrated 490 miles per hour and withstood the load. On July 19th, the second production machine, K9788, was accepted by RAF representatives. On August 4th, the third production Spitfire entered service for the first time into the 19th Squadron, which had previously flown Gauntlet biplanes. In September, the RAF accepted 2 more aircraft, in October 13, and by the beginning of 1939, there were already 49 machines in service. Reginald Mitchell did not live to see his fighter in frontline units. He died on June 11, 1937, at the age of 42. Joseph Smith became Supermarine's chief designer. He brought the aircraft into production and created all subsequent modifications. In 1937, Supermarine received an additional order for 200 fighters. Interest was also shown abroad. The first to approach was Japan's Mitsubishi. Belgium, Turkey, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Switzerland, Lithuania, and Estonia also tried to place orders. Estonia even signed an agreement for 12 machines. Greece ordered 12, Portugal 15. Because the war had begun, none of this was fulfilled. Only 1 aircraft was handed over to France in July 1939 for familiarization. The first Spitfires were mastered by the 19th and 66th Squadrons at Duxford. Teething troubles surfaced immediately. A weak starter barely turned the engine. Early series Merlins consumed oil heavily, and with manual landing gear retraction, pilots hit their heads on the low canopy. Without much ado, a faster starter was installed, a bulge canopy was introduced, and the hydraulic system was switched to an engine-driven pump. The engine itself was also refined. On October 31st, the commander of the 19th Squadron, Cozzens, took 6 Spitfires into the air for an official photo shoot. By December 1938, the squadron had been fully equipped with 16 machines. The tempo increased. In May 1939, as many as 41 aircraft were produced. Starting with the 194th production example, the Merlin II was replaced by the Merlin III with a shaft designed for different propeller types. The very earliest machines had 2-bladed wooden fixed-pitch propellers. Because of the center of gravity, 60 kilograms of ballast were placed in the nose. From the 74th aircraft, they switched to a 3-bladed metal de Havilland propeller with 2 fixed pitches. By the end of 1939, the standard had become the 3-bladed de Havilland constant-speed propeller. Most Spitfire MKR aircraft were fitted with it, with the exception of a small batch with Rotol propellers. In the summer of 1940, the early machines were re-equipped en masse with the same constant-speed propellers. The gun sights at first were primitive, ring and bead. Only in July 1939 was the more advanced GM2 MK'd Seg sight adopted, but it appeared later on operational aircraft. It was also fitted to early machines right in the units. To prevent the gun bay locks from freezing at altitude, the armament compartments were heated with warm air. A little later, the pilot's seat was protected by an armor back 1/4 of an inch thick. In July 1939, they first tried to strengthen the armament. 2 20mm Hispano cannon with 60 rounds each were installed on aircraft L-1007. It even came out slightly lighter than with 8 machine guns, but due to worsened streamlining, the speed dropped a little. The main issue was that the cannon worked unreliably during maneuvers. The Hispano had originally been designed as a motor cannon, and in the wing, it required stiffer mounts and recoil damping. That took time. Meanwhile, the Second World War began. By September 1, 1939, the Royal Air Force had 306 Spitfires, and another 71 were being prepared for delivery. By mid-August, the first order had already been fulfilled. 10 squadrons had been completely re-equipped and 1 was undergoing retraining. The first combat was a sad one. On September 6th, Spitfires mistakenly shot down 2 Hurricanes. The first real clash with the enemy occurred on October 16th. 6 Spitfires intercepted 9. He-111s heading for the Firth of Forth base. 2 bombers fell into the sea and 1 was damaged. During the phony war, contacts with the enemy were rare. The aircraft were being conserved for Britain's air defense. On January 13, 1940, a cannon-armed Spitfire went into combat for the first time. 1 cannon failed, but the Heinkel was shot down. Intensive work began in July 1940 when Spitfires covered the troops retreating to Dunkirk. There, they first met their principal opponent, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Then there was a short respite. 8 more squadrons converted to the Spitfire. The aircraft of the 1940 production run received a constant speed propeller, external armored glass, reinforced armor protection in front of and behind the pilot, as well as protection ahead of the radiators and the antennas of the friend or foe transponder. Everything had to be paid for in weight and aerodynamics. The speed fell slightly. The armored glass alone ate about 6 miles per hour. By the end of spring, the installation of the 20mm Hispano cannon had been brought to working condition and troop trials could begin. The trial batch of cannon-armed fighters was designated Spitfire IB, and the machine gun versions were retrospectively designated IA and handed over to the 19th Squadron. In flight, the Spitfire I, by the standards of the time, seemed implausibly light and very fast. So fast that on ferry legs, pilots sometimes ran ahead of schedule and checked landmarks in advance, 10 minutes before the arrival point. The military ferry pilot and test pilot H.A. Taylor, pseudonym Indicator, wrote in flight in 1946 that the early Spitfires had no engine-driven hydraulic pump. The landing gear was retracted by a hand pump with a long handle on the right. Immediately after liftoff, one had to change hand position and then, flying the aircraft with the left hand, vigorously work the pump. Because of the very sensitive elevator, inexperienced pilots developed pitch oscillation. Over time, pilots learned to be equally adept with both hands and to control their movements, so that the inevitable jolts became almost invisible from the ground. Taylor also noted another small thing. On early machines, the throttle was inadequately frictioned, and due to vibration, the throttle lever could slowly creep back. Sometimes it was necessary to stop pumping the gear and change one's grip again to prevent a sudden engine stoppage. There was another small but unpleasant problem. Sometimes the travel of the landing gear retraction handle jammed halfway in the extend position. The gear-up indicators in the wings remained motionless, and the pilot was faced with a choice: risk a landing with the gear retracted. In such a case, the Spitfire could flip onto its nose. An alternative way to free the handle was purely airmanship. Push the nose down sharply and then, with a quick jerk, pull the stick back. After that, the mechanism would usually free up and the gear would be brought to the required position.